What I have here is the brand new 2025 Head Gravity Pro. This might be the most beautiful paint job I've ever seen in my life, plus you all already know how I feel about the frame itself, so this is going to be a very fun review. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. It's kind of funny, that old Gravity Pro review is one of the very first videos I made on this channel. I went back and watched it and you can definitely tell how much I like that racket, but my goodness was I terrible at presenting back then. Now there actually are a few more changes than I was initially expecting with this new one. Head has been pretty consistent about just adding Auxetic 2.0 and changing very little else with the rest of their lineup, but there is a little bit more to talk about here. We'll get into all of that in a second, but of course, as usual, let me remind you that any of the rackets we talk about on this channel you can check out on our website racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So first, we have to talk about this paint job because I feel like we've been waiting for years for brands to make something that looks this good. It's absolutely stunning, it's glossy, it's understated, but then it also has that cool modern element to it. I don't know if you can tell on camera, but this blue is actually color shifting. It pops a lot more in some lights than in others. Honestly, I can't think of any racket in the last 5 years that looks this good. Now let's talk about some of the actual substantial updates to the technology and the specs here. Of course, the major update is Auxetic 2.0 in the layup, which we now have in the Speed line, the Boom line, the Extreme, and the Prestige. The idea behind Auxetic 2.0 is to soften up the flex in the throat while also improving stability, and from my experience, it has made the rest of the lineup a little bit more muted as well. I'll talk about that in a lot more detail in the feel section. The next major update is actually to the grommets themselves. Head has added what they're calling half cap grommets here. Cap grommets were used pretty exclusively on the Prestige for most of that line's history. Their main purpose is to protect the frame from scratching. As you can see, they are a little bit more substantial than a normal grommet set. A byproduct of this wider design, though, is also a little bit more stability. Of course, when you add any material to the outside of your frame, you're going to make it more sturdy on off-center hits. The cap grommets here aren't nearly as long as on the Prestige. As you can see, they only cover about the top quarter of the hoop, but it's still something worth noting. Finally, they've actually changed the Gravity Pro's balance point. Now this is very interesting because one of the big issues people have with this frame is that it is a little bit more clunky than a lot of the other rackets these days. They've made it more head light. It now has a 310mm balance instead of 315, which could be exactly what's needed to make it feel that little bit quicker. They've kept the swing weight very similar though. I had the old one and the new one both strung with Alu power, swinging at 329 strung, which is actually quite a manageable swing weight, especially compared to the original 360 Plus Gravity Pro. I'm quickly going to finish off with the rest of the specs. It still weighs 315 grams. It has that same 100 square inch teardrop shape and 18x20 string pattern, and of course that paper thin constant 20mm beam. They have softened it up ever so slightly. This new one came in at 60 RA strung and the previous one came in at 61. That's obviously a very minimal difference, but now let's move on to talking about the feel, because my goodness, is it amazing on this racket. I've obviously been pretty vocal about how good the last two versions of the Gravity Pro felt, and it's absolutely no different here. Every time I play with this thing, it's really a cathartic experience for me. It provides some of the most amazing ball feel you can find right now, and that's because it has quite a classic feel, especially compared to a lot of these modern rackets nowadays. I actually think that comparing this to the E-Zone I just reviewed is pretty much the perfect example of what I mean when I talk about how these soft, modern rackets with a lot of stabilization technology have this sort of mushy, disconnected feel from the ball. Keep in mind, the new E-Zone and the Gravity Pro now have a very similar stiffness rating, but I was going back and forth between these two during my playtest, and the difference in feel is so obvious. The E-Zone is soft but very dampened, with a sweet spot that's so big and mushy that the racket doesn't really let you know when you're making good contact or bad contact, so it's super forgiving, but the downside is it's not very rewarding. The Gravity Pro is almost the opposite. Despite also being very soft, it has a super classic construction and not too much technology intruding on the feel, which means you're extremely connected to the ball. You know exactly where the ball is the whole time it's in the string bed, and then as it exits, you get this very unique sensation of feedback caused by vibrations making their way down into your hand. The thing about that feedback, and this is where it's really different compared to these soft, modern, forgiving rackets, that feedback is actually different depending on the quality of your shot. When you make poor contact, the frame produces negative vibrations, and when you make good contact, you get this uniquely positive feel. On the Gravity Pro, that good feedback feels almost like a crisp thwack. Think of this feedback as the racket giving you a sort of grade based on the quality of your shot. It's trying to communicate with you that your stroke was either good or bad. This is a sensation you can only really get with thin, constant beams like this, and it's especially notable on softer rackets because that dwell time is extended, which amplifies the feel. This is something that a lot of players, especially very good players, crave because it lets them know that they hit a high-quality shot, so they can dial in their stroke so that they're eventually making perfect contact every time. Personally, I prefer the hitting experience I get with rackets like this compared to these more ambiguous modern frames like the current blade in the E-Zone. I know that a forgiving feel could be more beneficial for my game, but that extra little dopamine hit you get when you make good contact with the Gravity Pro is just extraordinary. One of the unique things about tennis is that beautiful sensation when you make contact with the ball, which you don't really get in other sports. On rackets like this, it's just a little bit better, so it makes the beautiful part of tennis more fun. So the moral of the story is, the Gravity Pro has incredible feel, but how much has that feel actually changed coming from the last one? Well, honestly, not very much, but here's what you should expect. This new one feels a little bit softer and actually a little bit more raw than the previous one. If anything, the previous one had this sort of chalky feel to it, which I don't get at all here. I think this has more to do with the glossy paint than anything else. Sometimes this matte paint can give it that slightly chalky feel. It's really subtle, but that's the main difference here. In terms of that Auxetic 2.0 update, for me, it's been much more obvious on heads thicker beamed frames like the Extreme Pro, the Speeds, and even the Boom Pro. I already had a tough time feeling the difference with the Prestige, which has a really similar beam to the Gravity Pro, so I think it just generally has less of an effect on these more classic rackets, if that makes sense. I'm very happy about that. I was a little bit worried this racket might be way more muted, but that's not the case. I would still say the original 360 Plus probably has the most pure feel of the bunch, but that one also had a way higher swing weight. Head have done a really good job of lowering that swing weight on the last two, which makes these rackets easier to swing. But we do need to talk about that a little bit more because that difficulty factor has been the main criticism of this line since it first came out. This is obviously not an easy racket to swing. It weighs 315 grams, it still has a decently high swing weight, and then that combination of the 100 square inch head size with this teardrop shape definitely doesn't help make it feel fast. Some people have had issues with it feeling a little bit clunky, myself included, which is why I've never actually switched to it, by the way. I think this more headlight balance is head's attempt at quickening it up, but honestly, I don't feel that much of a difference. This still feels like a Gravity Pro. It's maybe a little bit whippier, but the swing weights are really similar, so I think they've just polarized the weight a little more, especially with that half cap grommet, which adds some mass at the top of the hoop. One thing I will say is that I was testing this one with an L2 grip, which is smaller than usual for me, and when you use a smaller grip, it can change the way the racket feels swinging through the air, usually making it feel less headlight. I do eventually want to try an L3, but for now, I'm pretty confident in saying that this hasn't magically become the fastest racket in the world. It still has a higher than average static and swing weight, but that is par for the course with this style of racket. Super thin rackets like this need weight to be stable and playable, and compared to other rackets that provide you with a similarly classic hitting experience, it's not actually that heavy. This 100 square inch teardrop head shape has a very unique way of making the sweet spot bigger and more stable, so while it is harder to swing than the average racket in 2025, it's still easier than true classic control rackets. I'm going to start using the word magic a lot throughout this review, and this is one of the first magical things about this racket. Insane stability at relatively low static and swing weight specs. The one thing I will say is that this head size and teardrop shape does concentrate a lot of the mass farther up the frame, which isn't too much of a problem when you're properly set up and swinging from the baseline, but it is a little bit more of an issue up at the net. It's not the most reactive racket, so probably not the best for you volley specialists, but again, it's not bad by any stretch of the imagination. When you compare it to something like the Speed Pro, for example, this feels quite a bit more maneuverable. It has a much thinner beam, which cuts through the air much more efficiently. It also has all the other ingredients for good volleys, especially that great feel and stability, so it'll definitely hold its own up there. So now that I've kind of established what you should expect in terms of feel and the way this racket swings through the air, I do want to explain how all of this translates in terms of control, power, and spin, starting with control. The Gravity Pro is first and foremost a proper control racket. In fact, I consider it to be the very best control racket right now, and I'll explain to you why. Everything about the specs here, except for that 100 square inch head size, screams control, starting with the 18 by 20 string pattern. 1820s are very dense, and dense string beds basically make it so that the strings themselves have less of an effect on the ball. Yes, that means that spin and power are lower, but it also means that the racket is less prone to randomly launching the ball, and it also has less of that trampoline effect. The best way to describe it is that 1820s feel more like a board, kind of like a blank canvas that allows you, the player, to be more in control of the effect you create onto the ball. You generate the power, you generate the spin. The strings don't really help you do any of that, but very good players may not want or need help from their strings. Then you've got the thin constant beam and the soft flex. It goes back to what I was saying earlier. That feedback makes it so that you can almost grab and place the ball exactly where you want in the court. Those of you who have played with rackets like this know exactly what I'm talking about. It's something that's becoming more and more rare with modern rackets, but that combination of 18 by 20 and soft thin beam has always been the holy grail for control. We also need to talk about stability, because it is phenomenal on this frame, and stability is extremely important for control because it gives you that rock solid feel and even more confidence in your frame. The Gravity Pro is so solid on contact, and it just seems to get better the harder you hit and the harder your opponent hits. It's probably the most stable stock frame right now, especially since the RF97 got discontinued. So that's the magical trifecta on the Gravity Pro. Rock solid stability, that impeccable feel, and then that blank canvas control that you can only get from an 1820. Now, a lot of that stability is thanks to this 100 square inch teardrop head shape, and 100 square inches I know we often associate with less control, but the Gravity Pro feels just as controlled and precise as the very best control rackets, and yes, rackets that have smaller head sizes. That's another part of the magic here. It just feels like they've nailed something special with this 20mm beam and this head shape. You get a lot of good playability with very, very few drawbacks. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that this is the most powerful and spin-friendly racket ever, especially not after telling you that 1820s are literally designed to kind of tone all that down, but what I am going to say is that this is more spin-friendly and powerful than average for a thin-beamed 1820. That shouldn't be too surprising. This is a 100, and a bigger head size means that logically the string bed is going to be a little bit more open than a 98, 97, or 95 square inch 1820. That's compared to other control rackets though. The reality is accessing that power and spin is still quite a bit harder than with a lot of the other rackets we have nowadays. This gives you very little for free, so you need to create most of the power and spin yourself, and to do that you need to generate a lot of racket head speed. Again, not easy when a racket weighs 315 grams with a high 320 swing weight, but when you do get the racket moving quickly here, there is a lot behind the ball. I think the Gravity Pro is a very good example of a racket that has very little easy depth, but a ton of plow through. Now, to get it moving quickly, you really got to focus on good technique, getting that whole kinetic chain going from your feet, your hips, your shoulders, and then eventually into your arm and your wrist. It was actually funny because I'm still injured, which is not the funny part, but I can't really move around the baseline too much these days, which is why most of my reviews I'm just hitting cross court to get a good feel for the frame. The thing about that is that because I don't have to move to the ball, I'm pretty much perfectly set up for every shot, and I can really focus on getting that technique as good as possible. There were some rallies with this racket where I'm just sat behind the baseline rocketing the ball off the string bed by getting that full body rotation and plowing through it with tons of racket head speed. The feedback, control, and power that I was getting when doing that was absolutely phenomenal, and it really proves that if you're a good player who's properly set up for every shot, you can generate tons of power. The E-Zone and even the Pure Drive that I've been testing recently don't have that same crazy addictive plow through, so you definitely have access to power here. It just takes a little bit more work. It's kind of that classic idea where good players may actually get more power with control rackets since they can swing out with so much confidence, and this is one of the most powerful control rackets. Now for me, I can kind of feign perfect technique when I don't have to move to the ball, but when footwork gets involved, that's where things kind of become a little bit more difficult. I also think that power is maybe a little bit easier to generate with this new Gravity Pro. These half cap grommets add a little bit more weight in the upper hoop to plow through the ball, and I did feel like I was generally getting a bit more depth with this one compared to the last one. Now let's talk about spin, and again, it's not that inherently spin friendly, but you can still generate plenty of spin yourself with proper technique, especially compared to other 1820s because of the bigger head size. The one thing I don't love about spin here is that because of the way this hoop is shaped, you don't feel like you can brush up on the ball too easily. It is harder to hit these slower, loopy, rally spin balls. This racket really is made to hit through the ball, but you're also not getting an 1820 to default to spin as your margin shot. Your margin shot here is counterpunchy control, and again, compared to other counterpunchy control rackets, it is quite spin friendly, which is just another reason why it's so well adapted to the modern game. Every time I play with the Gravity Pro, I sit there thinking, my God, this racket is 100% made for the Pro Tour. It's a classic control racket in almost every sense, but because it's a little bit lighter and it has a bit more inherent power and spin, modern pros are going to absolutely love it because of the way the game has evolved. It also just seems to get better and better the faster you swing and the harder your opponent hits. I never feel like I get to a cap with this racket's playability. It's just so rock solid all the time. I will say it's definitely more of a baseliner stick. Huge serve because of the head shape, and then its bread and butter is a combination of high margin counterpunching with massive directional ground strokes when you want to take over the point. Because it's a little slow, it's not the best racket for scrambling a net play, but again, you definitely can play that style with it. I also have to say that you certainly don't have to be a pro to enjoy this racket, especially if you like playing tennis for the feel of it. This is one of those high dopamine hit control rackets that kind of brings me back to the feel we had before all this modern tech, and I gotta say I love that. I do still think you need to understand that you are swinging something pretty heavy, so you shouldn't go out there and just arm at the ball or swing lazily because you're not gonna get the most out of it that way. Keep reminding yourself, footwork, timing, full body rotation, that's when the racket's really going to start to shine, and shine it will. That's also why I haven't fully committed to switching to it, by the way. I'm not sure I'm good enough to do that consistently, and I do want a racket that maybe helps me out a little bit more, rather than one that's always demanding the most of me. It is really fun to use though, so we'll see. But anyways, hopefully you all enjoyed this review. You all know how much I like this racket. I hope that passion made its way through the screen here. This is just such a special racket in the modern game. It hasn't changed all that much, which is a real positive for me. It's maybe a little bit easier to swing, but not nearly as drastic of a change as it was on the previous one. With that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching. The Gravity Pro will be available for demo starting in January, and that's also when you're going to be able to go online and buy it at racketsandrunners.ca.